chocolate is scrumptious when it crunches. That's why I love Nestle Crunch.
The Chocolate Bar That Went to War. Chapter 1. The Impossible Request. In April 1937, a U.S. Army officer walked into the headquarters of Hershey Chocolate Company in Hershey, Pennsylvania, carrying specifications for a product that shouldn't be possible to create. He needed a chocolate bar that could survive conditions that would destroy any normal chocolate. The requirements were specific and contradictory. The bar must weigh exactly 4 ounces. It must provide 600 calories, enough to sustain a soldier for a short period as an emergency ration. It must withstand temperatures up to 120 degrees Fahrenheit without melting. It must fit in a soldier's pocket. And crucially, it must taste a little better than a boiled potato. That last requirement was deliberate and strange. The army didn't want the chocolate to taste good. If it tasted too good, soldiers would eat it as a snack rather than saving it for emergencies. It needed to be palatable enough to consume when necessary, but not so appealing that troops would waste it frivolously. Captain Paul Logan, the officer delivering these specifications, explained the military's thinking. Modern warfare was mechanized, mobile, fast-moving. Soldiers might find themselves cut off from supply lines, unable to access regular rations. They needed emergency food that was compact, calorie-dense, and stable under extreme conditions. Previous emergency rations had failed. Hardtack biscuits, a Civil War staple, were durable but provided insufficient calories and minimal nutrition. Pemmican, a concentrated mixture of fat and protein used by explorers, was calorie-dense but unpalatable and difficult to produce in quantity. The army wanted something better. Chocolate seemed ideal. It was energy-dense, relatively nutritious, familiar to American soldiers, and psychologically comforting. The problem was that chocolate melted. Traditional chocolate bars became liquid messes in summer heat, unusable in tropical climates or even temperate regions during warm months. The Hershey Company was America's largest chocolate manufacturer. Milton Hershey had built an empire on milk chocolate, making it affordable for ordinary Americans. His factory could produce millions of bars annually. If anyone could solve the military's problem, it was Hershey. But the challenge was formidable. Chocolate's melting point is determined by cocoa butter content. Reduce the cocoa butter, and you raise the melting point. But you also make the chocolate harder, less pleasant to eat. The texture becomes grainy, waxy, unpleasant. The specifications demanded the impossible. Chocolate that wouldn't melt at 120 degrees, but would still be consumable. Chocolate with enough calories to sustain life, but compact enough for a pocket. Chocolate that lasted indefinitely without refrigeration, but didn't taste so bad that soldiers would refuse to eat it even when starving. Samuel Hinkle, Hershey's chief chemist, listened to Captain Logan's requirements and understood the challenge immediately. This wasn't just difficult. It might be chemically impossible. The properties the army wanted contradicted the fundamental nature of chocolate, but the army was insistent. War was coming. Everyone could see that. Germany was rearming, Japan was aggressive in Asia, and the United States needed to prepare. Emergency rations were essential. Soldiers' lives might depend on this chocolate bar. Hinkle agreed to try. He gathered his team of chemists and began experimenting. They had no idea if they could succeed. They weren't even sure where to start. But the request had been made, and Hershey would attempt to answer it. The the development of what would become the D-ration bar was beginning, and it would require Hershey to essentially reinvent chocolate, creating something that preserved the name but bore little resemblance to the candy Americans knew and loved. If you love stories of the past, the kind that remind us how small inventions shaped the world, consider subscribing. We make these videos free so you can fall asleep learning something new about history. Your support helps us keep these quiet stories alive. Now let's get back to the video. Reinventing chocolate. Samuel Hinkle's team began with a fundamental problem. Cocoa butter melts at around 93 to 995 degrees Celsius. This is why chocolate feels smooth in your mouth. It melts at body temperature. But it's also why chocolate bars turn into puddles in summer heat. To create chocolate that survived 120 degrees Celsius, they needed to dramatically reduce cocoa butter content. But cocoa butter is what makes chocolate creamy and pleasant to eat. Remove it, and you're left with cocoa powder. Dry, bitter, difficult to form into bars. The team experimented with replacing cocoa butter with other fats that had higher melting points. Vegetable oils, animal fats, synthetic compounds. They tried everything. Most resulted in products that were technically stable but inedible. They tasted terrible, had awful textures, or caused digestive problems. They tried adding more sugar to compensate for the bitterness of high cocoa, low butter formulations. But sugar attracts moisture, which could cause the bars to spoil. And too much sugar made the bars too sweet, which contradicted the little better than a boiled potato requirement. Texture was another challenge. Normal chocolate is smooth because the cocoa butter lubricates the cocoa particles. Without sufficient cocoa butter, the mixture was gritty, hard to chew, difficult to swallow. Soldiers eating this under stress, possibly dehydrated, might choke on it. The team developed formulations that balanced these competing requirements. They reduced cocoa butter to minimal levels, raising the melting point significantly. They added oat flour to provide texture and binding. They included sugar for palatability and energy, but not enough to make the bar appealing. The proportions were critical. Too much cocoa, and the bar was bitter and crumbly. Too much oat flour, and it tasted like cardboard. Too much sugar, and it was too pleasant. Soldiers would eat it as candy. The formula needed to occupy a precise point between inedible and enjoyable. They also addressed the caloric requirement. Normal chocolate provides about 150 calories per ounce. The army wanted 600 calories in 4 ounces. 150 calories per ounce, same as regular chocolate. This was achievable, but barely, given the constraints on ingredients. Vitamins were considered. Should the bar be fortified with nutrients to provide more than just calories? The military was interested, but Hershey's chemists worried that vitamins might degrade during storage or affect flavor. Eventually, basic fortification was included, but minimally. The production process required innovation too. Normal chocolate is tempered, heated, and cooled in specific ways to create stable crystal structures that give chocolate its snap and shine. This process depends on cocoa butter content. With their modified formula, traditional tempering didn't work. They developed a new process involving different temperature cycles and mechanical mixing. The result wasn't beautiful. The bars had a dull, matte appearance rather than chocolate's typical gloss. But they held together, didn't melt, and could be produced in quantity. After months of experimentation, they had a viable prototype. It was a rectangular bar, dense and hard. The color was darker than milk chocolate, almost grayish-brown. The texture was grainy, the taste bitter with a slight sweetness. It was, objectively, unpleasant to eat. But it met the specifications. It weighed 4 ounces. It provided 600 calories. It withstood heat that would liquefy normal chocolate. It fit in a pocket. And it tasted bad enough that you wouldn't want to eat it unless you were genuinely hungry. Captain Logan tested samples in various conditions. Samples were left in ovens at 120 degrees Celsius for days. They softened slightly but didn't melt. They were frozen, then thawed. They remained intact. They were dropped, crushed, subjected to rough handling. They held together. Soldiers tested them under field conditions. The feedback was consistent. The bars were barely palatable, but edible when necessary. They provided energy. They didn't cause digestive issues. They were psychologically comforting. Having chocolate, even terrible chocolate, was better than nothing. In 1938, the Army approved the formula. Production began on what would officially be called the Field Ration D. Unofficially, soldiers would call it many things, few of them complimentary. But it worked. Hershey had achieved the impossible. Chocolate that defied chocolate's nature. The D ration bar was ready. Now it just needed a war. Chapter 3. The Factory at War. When the United States entered World War II in December 1941, Hershey's factory in Pennsylvania transformed overnight from a candy manufacturer into a military contractor. The scale of demand was staggering. The Army wanted millions of D-ration bars. Every soldier deployed overseas would carry them as emergency rations. That meant producing enough bars to supply an army that would eventually number over 16 million men. Milton Hershey, the company's founder, was in his 80s but still involved in operations. He threw the company's full resources behind the war effort. Civilian chocolate production was reduced. Entire production lines were converted to military rations. The D-ration bars were manufactured differently from normal chocolate. The formula was mixed in large batches, then poured into molds. Not the smooth molds used for candy bars, but simple rectangular forms designed for efficiency rather than aesthetics. The bars were wrapped in plain brown paper, then sealed in wax-coated cardboard boxes. No fancy packaging, no branding beyond basic identification. This was military equipment, not consumer product. Function over form. Quality control was rigorous. Every batch was tested for melting point, caloric content, and shelf stability. Bars were stored in heated rooms for weeks to ensure they wouldn't degrade. Some were deliberately subjected to rough handling to verify durability. The factory ran 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. Workers were recruited aggressively. Women, older men, anyone who could work a production line. Hershey provided housing, childcare, and transportation to attract workers in a tight labor market. By 1943, Hershey was producing over 500,000 D-ration bars daily. The bars were shipped to distribution centers, then to ports, then to battlefields worldwide. They went to North Africa, Italy, France, the Pacific Islands, Burma, everywhere American forces operated. Other rations were developed alongside the D-bar. The tropical chocolate bar was formulated for even more extreme heat, designed for jungle warfare in the Pacific. It was even less palatable than the D-ration, but survived temperatures that would destroy the regular version. Hershey also produced the Field Ration K, a slightly different formulation designed for longer-term use. Where the D-ration was pure emergency food, the K-ration was part of a complete meal package. The K-ration chocolate was marginally more pleasant, but still far from enjoyable. The factory became a source of pride for the community. Hershey, Pennsylvania, was a company town. Milton Hershey had built the entire community around his factory. Now that factory was supporting the war effort, and residents felt they were contributing directly to victory. Workers bought war bonds. The company organized scrap drives. Hershey himself donated substantial sums to the war effort. The factory that had made candy for American children was now making survival rations for American soldiers. Production volume was staggering. By war's end, Hershey had produced over 3 billion D-ration bars. 3 billion. Enough to supply every American service member multiple times over. The factory had become an essential part of military logistics. The transformation wasn't easy. Converting from consumer products to military contracts required new processes, new quality standards, new distribution systems. The company had to learn to work with military bureaucracy, meet rigid specifications, handle classified information. But Hershey adapted. The company that had democratized chocolate for American consumers now sustained American soldiers in combat. The mission had changed, but the commitment to quality and scale production remained. Milton Hershey would die in 1945, just before war's end. He lived to see his factory contributing to the war effort. His chocolate, however modified and unpleasant, helping to sustain the troops. It wasn't the legacy he'd envisioned when he started making candy decades earlier, but it was a legacy he was proud of. The factory would continue war production until 1945. When peace came, the production lines would convert back to consumer chocolate. The D-ration bars would gradually disappear from production, replaced by the sweet milk chocolate Americans preferred. But during the war, the factory served. It produced, it shipped, it sustained. The chocolate that went to war was made here, in this Pennsylvania town, by workers who understood they were doing essential work. The factory at war was a chocolate factory transformed, and in that transformation, it helped win a war. Chapter 4. In the Soldier's Pocket, Private James Harrison, 1st Infantry Division, North Africa, 1943. The heat was unbearable, 120 degrees in the shade, and there was no shade. His unit had been pinned down for 6 hours, separated from supply lines, water running low. In his breast pocket, wrapped in brown paper and wax cardboard, was a D-ration bar. He'd been issued 3 of them before deploying. He'd eaten one already during training, just to know what to expect. It had been awful, bitter, grainy, hard to chew, but it had been calories. Now, genuinely hungry, truly in need, he unwrapped the second bar. The packaging was intact despite the heat, despite being crushed against his chest for weeks. The bar inside was solid, unchanged. In this temperature, a normal Hershey bar would have been liquid chocolate soup. The D-ration was rock hard. He bit into it. The texture was like chewing compressed dirt mixed with cocoa. The taste was bitter, slightly sweet, fundamentally unpleasant. But it was food, and after 6 hours without eating, with adrenaline fading and exhaustion setting in, it was exactly what he needed. He chewed slowly, deliberately. The bar was dense, difficult to swallow without water. He sipped from his canteen between bites, making the bar last, extracting every calorie. It wasn't enjoyable, but it was sustaining. Across the Pacific, Corporal Sarah Mitchell, Army Nurse Corps, ate her D-ration during a brief rest between surgeries at a field hospital in New Guinea. The jungle heat was oppressive, but the chocolate bar remained solid. She ate it mechanically, not tasting it, simply refueling. In the frozen Ardennes forest during the Battle of the Bulge, Sergeant Robert Quinn shared his D ration with a wounded soldier. The bar was so hard from cold that they had to warm it under their arms before it could be bitten. But even in sub-zero temperatures, it remained edible, providing calories that helped them survive until evacuation. The D ration's unpleasant taste became the subject of soldier humor. Jokes circulated about how bad it was, each more creative than the last. Some said it tasted like chocolate-flavored wax mixed with sawdust. Others claimed the army had made it deliberately terrible as punishment. The complaints were universal and good-natured. Everyone hated the D ration, but everyone appreciated having it. Letters home mentioned the D rations, usually humorously. "Send candy," soldiers wrote. "The army gives us chocolate that tastes like they forgot to add chocolate." Families sent care packages with real candy, which soldiers treasured and saved for special occasions. But when emergency struck, when units were cut off, when supplies couldn't reach forward positions, when hunger became serious rather than mere inconvenience, the D rations were there. Soldiers complained about the taste, then ate them anyway and survived. The psychological comfort was real. Having chocolate, even terrible chocolate, was reassuring. It was a taste of home, however distorted. It was familiar in environments that were utterly foreign and often terrifying. Opening that brown wrapper and finding chocolate, however unpleasant, provided a moment of normalcy. Some soldiers developed rituals around their D rations. They'd save them for specific situations, only eating them after particularly difficult days or before expected combat, or when morale was especially low. The bars became talismans, emergency reserves, both physical and psychological. Medical officers noted that soldiers would share D rations with wounded comrades, using them to provide quick calories to men in shock or suffering blood loss. The high caloric density made them medically useful, and the chocolate taste, however muted, was comforting to injured men. In prison camps, D rations took on special significance when they appeared in Red Cross packages. Prisoners would ration them carefully, making a single bar last days or weeks. The calories were precious, but so was the connection to the American supply system, the reminder that they weren't forgotten. Pacific Island landings saw D rations consumed in large quantities. The heat, the exertion, the stress of combat, all created enormous caloric needs. The bars were eaten quickly, barely tasted, simply fuel for men pushing their bodies to extremes. Bomber crews carried D rations on missions. If shot down, they'd need emergency food until rescue or capture. The bars survived the altitude and cold of high-altitude flight, then the heat and humidity if crews went down in jungles or deserts. The D ration fulfilled its purpose. It wasn't pleasant, but it wasn't supposed to be. It was emergency food that worked under conditions that would destroy normal food. And soldiers, however much they complained about the taste, appreciated its reliability. In the soldier's pocket, the D ration waited, ready to sustain, ready to comfort, ready to keep a soldier alive when everything else had failed. It tasted terrible, but it worked, and in war, working was enough. Chapter 5, The Taste of Survival, continued. Some soldiers tried to improve the bars. They'd mix crumbled D ration with coffee to make a bitter chocolate drink. They'd combine it with sugar packets from other rations. Some melted it and mixed it with powdered milk, creating something resembling hot chocolate, though still inferior to the real thing. Others found that eating the bar very slowly, in tiny pieces, made it more tolerable. Breaking off small chunks and letting them dissolve gradually minimized the texture issues and distributed the unpleasant taste over time. This method required patience, but worked better than trying to consume the bar quickly. The bitterness was the most consistent complaint. The high cocoa content and low sugar created a harsh, astringent flavor that hit the back of your tongue and lingered. Some soldiers claimed they could feel their mouths puckering, though this was likely psychosomatic rather than chemical. Yet despite universal agreement that the taste was terrible, there was also universal agreement that it was preferable to starvation. When the choice was between eating an unpleasant chocolate bar and going hungry, the bar was always chosen. The taste became a shared experience, a common reference point among soldiers. Everyone had eaten D rations. Everyone agreed they were awful. This shared suffering created camaraderie. You could bond with soldiers you'd just met by complaining about D rations. Interestingly, some soldiers reported that after eating D rations regularly for weeks or months, they became slightly more tolerable. Not good, never good, but less aggressively bad. Whether this was genuine taste adaptation or psychological adjustment is unclear. After the war, many veterans reported that they could never eat dark chocolate again. The high cocoa content of the D ration had created an association between bitter chocolate and hardship. They preferred milk chocolate or avoided chocolate entirely, the wartime experience permanently affecting their tastes. But they also reported gratitude. However bad the D ration tasted, it had sustained them when nothing else was available. It had kept them alive through combat, through being cut off from supplies, through the countless situations where emergency calories meant survival. The taste of the D ration was the taste of survival. Unpleasant, but effective. It was chocolate that had sacrificed everything that made chocolate enjoyable in service of a higher purpose. And for the men who depended on it, the terrible taste was a small price to pay for the life it sustained. Years later, when the last D rations were finally consumed or discarded, soldiers remembered the taste vividly. It wasn't a pleasant memory, but it was a powerful one. The flavor of necessity, of emergency, of survival against odds. The chocolate that went to war tasted like war itself, bitter, harsh, but ultimately the thing that brought you home. 6. Beyond the battlefield. The D ration bar's influence extended far beyond feeding soldiers. It transformed chocolate manufacturing, influenced post-war product development, and created technologies that still affect how we make and package food today. Hershey's work on the D ration solved fundamental problems in food science. Creating stable chocolate that resisted melting required understanding cocoa chemistry at a molecular level. The research conducted during wartime advanced knowledge about how fats crystallize, how sugars interact with proteins, and how ingredients can be modified to achieve specific properties. These discoveries had commercial applications. After the war, Hershey applied lessons learned from the D ration to improving their consumer products. Better temperature stability meant chocolate bars could be distributed to warmer regions without melting during shipping. Modified formulations created products with longer shelf lives. The packaging innovations were equally important. The wax-coated cardboard and moisture barrier wrapping, developed for the D ration, kept chocolate fresh under extreme conditions. Post-war, these techniques influenced commercial chocolate packaging, helping bars survive longer on store shelves. Other food manufacturers studied Hershey's work. The military's need for compact, stable, calorie-dense foods drove innovations across the industry. Energy bars, protein bars, and other modern convenience foods trace their lineage partly to the D ration's development. The concept of emergency rations themselves evolved. Before the D ration, military food was either full meals or crude provisions like hardtack. The D ration established a new category, compact emergency food, designed to be carried constantly and consumed only when necessary. This influenced how militaries worldwide approached field rations. Post-war, the US military continued developing the concept. The D ration was eventually replaced by improved formulations, but the basic idea persisted. Modern MREs, meals ready to eat, include dessert components that owe something to the D ration's legacy, though they taste far better. NASA borrowed the concept for space food. The requirements for space: compact, stable, long-lasting, calorie-dense, paralleled military needs. Some of the early space food development drew on lessons learned from the D ration. Astronauts on Apollo missions carried chocolate bars descended from Hershey's wartime research. The D ration also influenced civilian emergency preparedness. Survival kits, disaster supplies, and emergency food storage often included chocolate or chocolate-based products designed using principles developed for the D ration. The idea that chocolate could be engineered for extreme stability became common knowledge. Mountaineers and explorers adopted D rations or similar products. The bars were ideal for expeditions: lightweight, calorie-dense, and stable under temperature extremes. Post-war surplus D rations were purchased by climbing clubs and expedition organizers who valued their reliability. The candy industry learned from the D ration's failures as much as its successes. The bars demonstrated what happened when you prioritized stability over palatability. You created something functional but undesirable. Post-war chocolate products aimed to balance both goals, creating bars that tasted good but also survived shipping and storage. Tropical chocolate formulations, descended from the D ration's tropical variant, became important for global markets. As chocolate companies expanded into hot climates, they applied lessons from wartime development. Chocolate could now be sold in regions where it had previously melted immediately. The economics of war production influenced Hershey's business model. The company had learned to operate at massive scale with thin margins. This experience shaped post-war strategy, allowing aggressive expansion and competitive pricing that made Hershey the dominant American chocolate manufacturer. The technical knowledge accumulated during the war became intellectual property. Hershey held patents on various processes developed for military chocolate. Some of these were licensed to other manufacturers, creating revenue streams and spreading innovations throughout the industry. Educational institutions studied the D ration as a case study in applied food science. The project demonstrated how theoretical chemistry and practical engineering could combine to solve real-world problems under time pressure and rigid specifications. It became a teaching example in food science programs. The legacy wasn't always positive. Some food scientists argued that the D ration represented over-engineering, creating a product so focused on one metric, heat stability, that it failed at others, palatability. This cautionary tale influenced how subsequent military and emergency foods were developed. But overall, the D ration's influence was profound and lasting. a product designed for one specific wartime purpose, ended up advancing food science, influencing multiple industries, and creating technologies that persisted for decades. The terrible-tasting emergency chocolate bar had pushed the boundaries of what chocolate could be, and the industry never forgot those lessons. The chocolate that went to war, came home, changed, and it changed the chocolate that stayed behind. Chapter 7. Letters from Home. Dear Jimmy, the letter began, written in his mother's careful script. Thank you for your last letter. We're so glad you're safe. I'm sending this package with some things we thought you might enjoy. I know the army feeds you, but I wanted to send real chocolate, not that awful stuff you wrote about. This scene repeated millions of times during the war. Families back home read letters complaining about D rations and responded by sending real chocolate in care packages. The contrast between military rations and home candy became a recurring theme in wartime correspondence. The packages were prepared with care. Mothers and wives packed chocolate bars carefully, wrapping them in wax paper, surrounding them with other items to cushion them. They knew the packages would travel thousands of miles through various climates before reaching their destination. Many packages arrived with melted chocolate. Despite careful packing, the journey by ship across the Pacific or through the Mediterranean to North Africa exposed the packages to heat that liquefied conventional chocolate. Soldiers received boxes with chocolate-stained contents, the candy reduced to unappetizing brown smears. The irony wasn't lost on anyone. The Army's terrible-tasting D ration arrived intact, ready to eat. Mother's delicious Hershey bars, sent with love from home, arrived as chocolate soup. Functionality had triumphed over quality, a frustrating but undeniable reality. Some families learned to send chocolate only during cooler months, timing their packages to avoid summer heat. Others switched to sending chocolate cookies or brownies, which survived shipping better than bars. The logistics of sending chocolate to war zones became knowledge shared among military families. Soldiers wrote honestly about the D rations. They gave us chocolate bars today, one letter reported. I use the term chocolate loosely. They taste like someone described chocolate to someone who had never tasted it, and they tried to make it from that description alone. Another wrote, the D ration bars keep me alive, but I wouldn't feed them to my worst enemy back home. Send real chocolate if you can, but honestly, the Army chocolate works even if it tastes terrible. The humor in these letters was protective. Soldiers making light of hardship to spare their families worry. But the complaints were genuine. The D rations taste was so universally disliked that it became a safe topic, something soldiers could complain about that wouldn't alarm loved ones. Families responded with sympathy and packages. The flow of care packages containing chocolate increased steadily through the war. Even when the chocolate arrived melted, soldiers appreciated the gesture. They'd scrape melted chocolate from wrapping paper, salvaging what they could. Some soldiers received multiple care packages. They'd save the civilian chocolate for special occasions, after successful missions, before expected combat, or to share with close friends. The real chocolate became currency, traded and gifted, its value far exceeding its cost. Soldiers also sent D rations home as curiosities. I'm sending you one of these Army chocolate bars, a letter explained. Try it so you'll understand what I'm complaining about. Don't worry, I have plenty. They give us more than we want. Families who received D rations were usually shocked by the taste. The contrast between familiar Hershey's chocolate and the military version was dramatic. Mothers who'd questioned whether the bars could really be as bad as their sons claimed were quickly convinced. These D-ration bars became conversation pieces. Families would serve them to visitors, inviting them to taste what the soldiers were eating. The reactions were consistent: surprise, disgust, and newfound respect for the soldiers enduring such food. The correspondence about chocolate became part of wartime memory. After the war, letters were saved, and families remembered the chocolate exchanges. Veterans would show their children the letters where they'd complained about D-rations, connecting wartime experience to tangible, relatable details. The letters also revealed class differences. Wealthier families sent larger, more frequent care packages with premium chocolate. Working-class families sent what they could afford, often saving ration coupons to buy chocolate to send overseas. But all families understood that sending chocolate meant sending love. Religious organizations coordinated chocolate drives, collecting donations to send to troops who might not have families sending packages. The USO organized shipments. Churches held fundraisers. Chocolate from home became not just family support, but community support. The relationship between home chocolate and army chocolate created a narrative that connected civilians to military experience. Everyone knew what chocolate tasted like. Learning that army chocolate was terrible made the hardship tangible in a way that descriptions of combat couldn't. This shared knowledge that D-rations were awful but necessary became part of American wartime culture. It was something everyone could understand and discuss, a small window into military life that was accessible even to those who'd never experienced combat. The letters from home, filled with chocolate and love, sustained soldiers differently than the D-rations did. One provided calories, the other provided connection. Both were essential, both were appreciated, and both were remembered long after the war ended. Chapter 8. The Competition Heat. Hershey wasn't the only chocolate manufacturer contributing to the war effort. Mars, Incorporated, the second largest American chocolate company, also produced military rations. The wartime competition between the two companies was fierce, though officially friendly. Mars developed their own version of heat-stable chocolate, designed to meet similar specifications as Hershey's D-ration. The Mars bar used a different formula: more nougat, less cocoa, alternative stabilizers. They claimed their version was slightly more palatable while still meeting military requirements. The Army conducted taste tests. Soldiers were given unmarked samples of both Hershey and Mars military chocolates and asked to rate them. The results were mixed. Some preferred Hershey's, others Mars. Both were universally disliked compared to regular chocolate, but opinions differed on which was less bad. Mars argued that their formula was superior for certain applications. The nougat base survived jungle humidity better than pure chocolate. In the Pacific Theater, Mars bars were often preferred by troops operating in wet conditions, where Hershey bars could absorb moisture. Hershey countered that their formula was more thermally stable. In North African and Middle Eastern deserts, where temperatures exceeded 130 degrees, Hershey bars remained solid, while Mars bars softened. Each company's formula excelled in different conditions. This led to the Army ordering both, distributing them according to theater of operations. Troops in the Pacific generally received Mars bars. Troops in North Africa and Europe received Hershey. soldiers noticed and had opinions about which they preferred, though most agreed both were equally terrible. The competition drove innovation. Each company worked to improve their formula, trying to create military chocolate that was marginally more pleasant while still meeting stability requirements. Small improvements were achieved: slightly better texture, somewhat less bitter taste, though neither company created genuinely good military chocolate. Production volume became a point of pride. Hershey's larger facilities gave them an advantage in total output. They produced more bars and supplied more of the military's needs. Mars emphasized quality over quantity, claiming their bars were more carefully manufactured. Advertising after the war reflected this competition. Both companies marketed themselves as having supported the troops. Hershey emphasized their volume. Billions of bars produced. Mars highlighted their innovation and the preferences of soldiers who'd received their bars. The rivalry extended to civilian markets. After the war, both companies applied lessons learned from military production to consumer products. Each claimed their chocolate was superior because of wartime refinements. Consumers mostly didn't care. They wanted chocolate that tasted good, and both companies delivered that. Smaller chocolate manufacturers also participated in military production. Nestlé produced chocolate for Allied forces, particularly British and Canadian troops. Their formulations differed from American versions, reflecting different taste preferences and available ingredients. The international dimension added complexity. American soldiers sometimes received British chocolate rations, which they found different but not necessarily better. British soldiers receiving American D rations had their own opinions, usually negative. Each nation's chocolate reflected their culinary traditions and industrial capabilities. German chocolate rations, when captured, were examined with interest. German military chocolate used different stabilizers and less sugar, reflecting wartime scarcity. American soldiers who tasted captured German chocolate generally found it worse than their own D rations, though some preferred its less sweet profile. Japanese military rations rarely included chocolate. It wasn't part of their culinary tradition. Instead, they used rice-based emergency rations. This cultural difference highlighted how even military food reflected national identity and traditions. After the war, the competition continued in different forms. Both Hershey and Mars expanded internationally, competing for global markets. The technical knowledge gained from military production gave both companies advantages in creating chocolate that could be shipped worldwide without melting. The relationship between the two companies remained complicated, officially cordial, privately competitive. Both could claim credit for supporting the war effort. Both had contributed genuinely, but both also wanted to be recognized as having done more, having done better. Veterans had mixed feelings about this corporate competition. Some appreciated that multiple companies had contributed, creating redundancy in supply. Others found the post-war marketing around military chocolate distasteful, commercializing their wartime suffering for corporate profit. But undeniably, the competition had benefits. It drove both companies to improve their formulations. It created alternatives when supply chains were disrupted. It ensured that no single manufacturer failure could compromise military food supplies. The chocolate that went to war went through many factories, made by many companies, using many formulas. But all of it was terrible. and all of it was appreciated. The competition produced more of what soldiers needed, even if what they needed was chocolate they hated eating. Chapter 9. After the war. When World War II ended in 1945, the military suddenly had less need for D-rations. Production was scaled back dramatically. The factories that had run 24/7 for years returned to normal schedules. Chocolate manufacturing shifted back to consumer products. Millions of D-ration bars remained in military inventory. Some were distributed to occupation forces in Japan and Germany. Others were stored in warehouses, held in reserve for potential future conflicts. Vast quantities were declared surplus and sold to civilian markets. Outdoor recreation companies bought surplus D-rations in bulk. They were repackaged and sold to hikers, mountaineers, and campers who valued the bar's durability and caloric density. The terrible taste was less important than reliability and long shelf life. Some surplus bars were donated to disaster relief organizations. When natural disasters struck, hurricanes, earthquakes, floods, emergency workers distributed D-rations to displaced populations. The bars provided quick calories to people whose homes and food supplies had been destroyed. Educational institutions received surplus bars for demonstration and study. Food science programs examined the formulation, using it to teach students about ingredient modification and stability. Chemistry classes analyzed the molecular structure. The D-ration became a teaching tool. Some bars simply sat in warehouses for years. Military supply depots contained pallets of D-rations that aged slowly in climate-controlled storage. Occasional tests showed that the bars remained edible decades after manufacture, though whether edible meant safe or palatable was debatable. Veterans had mixed feelings about seeing D-rations after the war. For some, the bars evoked difficult memories of combat, of hardship, of fear. They had no desire to ever eat one again. Others felt nostalgic connection despite the terrible taste. A few kept D-rations as souvenirs, mementos of survival. Hershey transitioned back to civilian production eagerly. The company had essentially sacrificed its commercial business for the war effort, reducing civilian chocolate production to focus on military rations. Now they could return to making chocolate people actually wanted to eat. The Hershey bar of the late 1940s benefited from wartime research. The chocolate was more stable, survived shipping better, and had longer shelf life than pre-war versions. These improvements were marketed subtly. Consumers wanted chocolate that tasted good, not chocolate that survived desserts. Mars similarly applied wartime innovations to civilian products. The nougat formulations developed for military bars influenced the post-war Mars bar and Milky Way. Technical knowledge accumulated during the war gave both companies competitive advantages, but neither company emphasized their military work heavily in advertising. There was pride in having contributed to the war effort, but also recognition that associating chocolate with wartime rations wasn't good marketing. Chocolate should be about pleasure, not survival. The Korean War in the 1950s briefly revived D-ration production. The military's stockpiles were depleted and fresh supplies were needed. But this production was much smaller than wwii volume. The war was smaller, and military food science had advanced. New rations were being developed that were more palatable. By the 1960s, the D-ration was being phased out. Improved formulations that balanced stability and taste replaced it. The military's food procurement focused on creating rations that were both functional and reasonably pleasant to eat. The little better than a boiled potato requirement was abandoned. Modern military rations are vastly superior to the D ration. MREs include dessert components, cookies, candy, chocolate pudding that taste good enough to be acceptable to soldiers with choices. The D ration's sacrifice of taste for stability is no longer necessary, but the D ration's influence persists. The principle that food can be engineered for extreme conditions, that ingredients can be modified to achieve specific properties, that shelf stability and portability matter. These ideas remain central to military and emergency food development. Some D rations survived into the 21st century. Museums acquired specimens for historical collections. Military historians kept samples as artifacts. Occasionally, a veteran's possessions would include a D ration kept for decades, a tangible connection to wartime experience. These ancient bars, when tested, were usually still technically edible. They hadn't spoiled, hadn't grown mold, remained chemically stable. Whether anyone should eat a 70-year-old chocolate bar is questionable, but the bar's durability was undeniable. The post-war fate of the D ration is a study in how military technology transitions to civilian use, or doesn't. Some innovations transfer successfully, others remain specialized. The D ration's stability technology influenced commercial products, but the bars themselves were too specific to military needs for direct civilian adoption. What remained was memory. Veterans remembered D rations vividly: the taste, the texture, the situations in which they'd eaten them. That memory was part of wartime experience, as significant in its way as memories of combat or comrades. The chocolate that went to war came home, but it didn't stay. The war ended, the need ended, and the product faded away. What didn't fade was the story of chocolate engineered for survival, of taste sacrificed for function, of soldiers sustained by candy that tasted terrible but worked perfectly. The D ration after the war became history, and in becoming history, it achieved a kind of immortality. 10, the bar we remember. It's quiet now. In a museum somewhere, there's probably a D ration bar behind glass. The brown wrapper is faded, the cardboard box worn. The bar itself, if unwrapped, would be dark brown, hard as a rock, unchanged by decades. You can't taste history. But looking at that bar, you can imagine what it meant. Not just the calories or the chemistry, but the moment when a soldier, genuinely hungry, genuinely in need, unwrapped one and found sustenance in something deliberately made to taste bad. The D ration bar represents a peculiar moment in food history, when engineers created something specifically designed to not be enjoyable. The opposite of every other food product which aims to be delicious. The D ration aimed to be merely adequate. This inversion of normal food priorities reveals something important about necessity. When survival is at stake, taste becomes optional. Pleasure becomes luxury. Function is all that matters. The D ration embodied this with absolute clarity. Think about the specifications. 600 calories in 4 ounces, stable at 120 carbohydrates, fits in a pocket, tastes slightly better than a boiled potato. Every requirement driven by necessity, none by desire. The result was chocolate stripped of everything that made chocolate desirable, leaving only its core function as calorie delivery. The engineers at Hershey who created this understood they were making something no one would enjoy. That must have been strange, spending months perfecting a product designed to be unpleasant. But they also knew it would save lives, and that knowledge justified the work. Soldiers who ate D rations understood this trade-off intuitively. Yes, it tasted terrible, but it kept them alive. And being alive with bad-tasting chocolate was infinitely preferable to the alternative. Survival trumped taste every time. The story of the D ration is ultimately about priorities. What matters most? In war, survival. In emergency, sustaining life. The chocolate that tasted terrible succeeded because it kept soldiers alive, and nothing else mattered as much as that. But the story is also about human ingenuity. The challenge was genuinely difficult, creating chocolate that violated chocolate's fundamental nature. The solution required rethinking ingredients, processes, chemistry itself. What seemed impossible became possible through determination and expertise. And there's something touching about the imperfection. The D ration never became good. It remained terrible throughout the war, into the Korean War, until it was finally retired. It succeeded by being good enough, not by being perfect. Sometimes good enough is enough. The legacy lives on in unexpected ways. Every protein bar, every energy gel, every engineered food designed for extreme conditions owes something to the D ration. The principle that food can be optimized for specific purposes, even at the cost of palatability, is now common. The D ration proved it was possible. Veterans who survived the war carried memories of D rations for the rest of their lives. At reunions, they'd joke about the terrible chocolate, bonding over shared suffering. The bad taste became a positive memory, not because it was pleasant, but because it represented survival, shared experience, connection. Some veterans kept their unopened D rations for decades, small brown packages in dresser drawers or display cases. These weren't valuable. You could probably buy surplus D rations for pennies if you could find them. Their value was personal, emotional, memorial. The chocolate bar that went to war went through deserts where temperatures exceeded 130 degrees Fahrenheit and remained solid. It went through jungles where humidity rotted everything and stayed dry. It went through frozen European winters and remained edible. It went into pockets of soldiers who were scared, exhausted, wounded, lost. And when they needed calories to continue, to survive one more day, to make it home, the bar was there. Hard, bitter, unpleasant, but there. That reliability is the D ration's real legacy. Not the taste or the chemistry or the engineering, but the simple fact that it worked. When soldiers needed it, it didn't fail. That kind of reliability saves lives. So tonight, as you drift toward sleep, think about the chocolate bar, about Milton Hershey's factory turning from candy to war production, about Samuel Hinkle's chemists reinventing chocolate in laboratories. Think about the soldiers carrying brown-wrapped bars in their pockets, complaining about the taste, eating them anyway when hunger struck. About the mothers sending real chocolate from home that arrived melted, while the army's terrible chocolate arrived intact. Think about the irony of deliberately making chocolate taste bad, about the specifications that required it to be unpleasant, about the success measured not in satisfaction, but in survival. The chocolate bar that went to war wasn't delicious. It wasn't meant to be. It was meant to keep soldiers alive, and it did. Billions of times over, through heat and cold, through combat and crisis, through every hardship World War II inflicted. Tomorrow, if you eat chocolate, taste it consciously. Notice the smoothness, the sweetness, the way it melts pleasantly in your mouth. Appreciate those qualities, because the D ration had none of them. The D ration sacrificed everything that makes chocolate enjoyable to achieve one thing: reliability. And in that sacrifice, in that single-minded focus on function over form, it succeeded completely. The bar was hard, the taste was terrible, the texture was wrong, but it kept soldiers alive, and that made it, in its strange way, perfect. Not the chocolate we'd want, but the chocolate they needed, the chocolate that went to war and brought soldiers home. One bitter, hard, terrible bite at a time. The wrapper crinkles, the bar breaks. The taste is awful, but you're alive to taste it. And sometimes that's all that matters. Survival, the chocolate that made it possible. The bar we remember not because it was good, but because it was good enough.